So, I've decided to change the presentation of my content for the sake of the audience. Many of us out there have a message for the world, and as the quality of the content that's hosted by social media platforms continues to progress, it creates a demand for a more captivating experience for the viewers. And as of right now, in my opinion, the way I've been presenting my content seems to fall under the category of sleeping videos, and that won't do. So I took the advice of a dear friend and decided to take note on how some of the more influential content creators conduct their presentations. So as far as I've found, the visual stimulation is something that I'm missing, and the audience needs that. So I'll keep the original content. However, there are some topics I may end up covering again, but in a different format with more sources and visual effects. So that being said, I'd like to discuss some topics in the most universal and open-minded way and reflect on how I can come to these conclusions. God, creationism, modern zeitgeist, history, science, and how they can all be related. So, at the moment, the scientific community, for the most part, all agrees that the universe was started with the Big Bang, a singularity that grew at a rate faster than light can travel. According to science, this was the beginning of everything, the Genesis, a metaphorical battle that had taken place inside the singularity within the confines of the quantum realm itself. This expansion was due to 1 part in a trillion advantage that life had over death, and ever since, the universe and everything in it has mimicked the very nature of this singularity. The saying, life finds a way, even in the most unlikely scenarios, is a truth that has withstood the test of time itself. Everything in the universe, including this elusive singularity, has a nature to it, and I believe this nature is the very nature of God. A nature we all have a choice to mimic, but not mimic perfectly anymore. And I'll get into that later. Now, as far as I'm aware, Jesus Christ was the last person to mimic this nature perfectly. So for now, we can say that God has a nature that provides the healthiest kind of life and has done so since the very beginning of time. To provide the healthiest kind of life, we must provide the healthiest kind of love. But how does this relate to who we are as a species now? Well, I'm no biblical scholar, but I can imagine most of us would agree that the stories of the Garden of Eden is filled with vague metaphors that references humanity and how we relate to creation from the beginning. And rightfully so, these stories weren't written down while the garden was inhabited. No, these stories are commonly attributed to Moses, and Moses wasn't born until roughly 3,000 years after the garden was no longer inhabited. The stories had to be passed down from generation to generation before they were put into text. This doesn't disprove the Bible. This simply means there's a potential that Genesis could have room for a little interpretation, which I find to be beneficial, because as vague as the stories of Genesis has a tendency to be, the ability for self-interpretation of it creates a potential for a better understanding for these stories. It helps to make sense of it all. And that's something I would imagine we would be encouraged to do. I don't imagine it would be detrimental to the whole point of the Bible to have an accurate depiction of the very first known city. However, that doesn't mean there aren't stories or depictions of a lost city from our past. In fact, there's a lot. One story you may be familiar with is the lost story of Atlantis. I love this subject. A past that could be detrimental to our future. There are many accounts of this civilization, and Plato is probably the most famous historical figure to speak of this legend. According to Plato, Atlantis was inhabited by people who were once spiritually enlightened, immortal, and practiced unconditional love for everyone and everything. These people lived in accordance to the nature of God and practiced the same level of love that Jesus spoke of, at one point. The fall of Atlantis allegedly came after they had become prideful, and so their heavenly city met its fate through a cataclysmic flood. Graham Hancock, he's an English writer and a journalist who focuses his work around pseudoscientific theories that involves ancient civilizations, and according to Graham, Plato's claims can be backed up by modern science. According to Plato, these people were as if they were gods of antiquity. You see, back in Plato's time around 300 BC, people scoffed at his claims, but sophisticated science wasn't an option back then. However, A short while ago, geologists discovered a plethora of evidence that supports the story of the Great Flood of Noah in the Bible. This flood is referred to in the scientific community today as Meltwater Pulse 1b. A great flood of astronomical proportions took place roughly 11,500 years ago. So there is factual evidence that gives Plato credit for some of his teachings. Now this piques my curiosity. It wouldn't be too far-fetched to give Plato the benefit of the doubt, considering that roughly 2,300 years later he's still considered to be one of the most influential philosophers to ever exist. Plato had learned of this ancient civilization from his grandfather, and Plato's grandfather learned of this legend from a famous Greek lawmaker known by the name of Solon. Solon had learned of this legend from ancient Egyptian priests who kept these stories sacred through the perpetual teachings of historical accounts depicted by hieroglyphics carved and painted on the walls of the Temple of Sais. These hieroglyphics were created per instruction of a woman who was known as Neith, goddess of Atlantis. According to Inuit cosmology, Neith claimed to be the creator of the universe, mother of the sun god Ra, and creator of Apep, the great serpent. Where have we heard of the great serpent before, I wonder? Well, according to Genesis, the serpent whispered in Eve's ear that experiencing the fruits from the tree of knowledge will enlighten her on what it's like to be God. A lie. From what I understand, whatever activity it was Adam and Eve took part in, this had cursed the human race with death. Before then, from what I understand, death wasn't a thing. We were immortal, just like the inhabitants of Atlantis were described as being, living forever. It is written that the woman ate from the tree first, so it could be the Atlantean women had been worshipped by men in that society, as they are the selectors of who is and is not chosen for reproduction. I could be wrong, but if this was the case, this would have created a hierarchy that was based off who could cater to the woman's ego the most. But why cater to ego? Well, it's said that Atlantis was a Type 1 utopian civilization, which means the ability to survive in the wild was no longer met a woman's criteria for determining a man's value and worth. And because of the technology, the only thing a man could do successfully to reproduce was to provide pleasure rather than safety, and the men who were the most successful were seen as the alpha men, and this would create envy amongst those who were unsuccessful. This would eventually lead to the worship of men and women both. Through worship, they experienced what it would be like to be God, or at least what they believed what it would be like. This, combined with an enlightened mind, temporary immortality, would create a God complex, hence the relentless claims of themselves being gods to all of these cultures around the world, thus creating the lore of pagan gods. Whatever the case may be, I believe our molecular structures within the human DNA had changed by taking part in whatever this activity was, and this genetic change was perpetuated through the children through a process known as the evolutionarily stable strategy. A curse of pride, this curse is sin that leads to death, and sin seems to be an action that does not foster life in any way, and we as a species have this sin genetically programmed into our DNA. So covenants had to be made between the true God of Abraham and the human species, and I believe the purpose of these covenants was to slow the progression of this curse in the most efficient way possible, as to maintain the flawed ability to humbly mimic the nature of God. However, due to the perpetuation of compromised DNA, it is an inevitability that the entirety of the human race will one day no longer host the capacity to desire a connection with God. This will create a world completely void of God, the very nature and definition of hell itself. This created a necessity for a Messiah. This is where Jesus Christ came to save us from the curse of sin itself by expressing God's forgiveness for those who comply with the new covenant, and the fulfillment of this covenant through the unjustified death of a perfect being. Love God with all our heart and soul, keep God's commandments, love thy neighbor, and love thine enemy. And if you fail, remember the sacrifice Christ made for you and try again. With love is how we are supposed to live our lives. By doing this, you'll be provided with a saved soul. You'll become a part of a population that will be saved from an apocalyptic event described to us in Revelations. This second coming of Christ will save a large portion of humanity from this destruction. Essentially, you're contributing to the saving of the human race by accepting Christ, and I couldn't possibly think of a better way to contribute to the world. So, if we want our world to be a better home, for now. We have to make our home a better world. And to do this, we have to seek wisdom from somewhere. We have to learn what love is, and we have to apply it every day, every chance we get.